Welcome back. We're talking about functionalism as a theory about minds. We began the semester with a piece of science fiction, Ted Chiang's Exhalation. An interesting question we could ask is, how does Chiang's way of describing his protagonist fit with the various theories we've been discussing? For now, I want to briefly introduce you to another character, Richard Dodge Forthrast, from a couple of Neal Stephenson's novels. In the second novel featuring him, Fall or Dodge in Hell, Dodge unexpectedly dies. And when he dies, his friends and family discover that he had, years before, signed up to have his body cryogenically preserved in case he could ever be revived in the future. But it turns out that the actual agreement doesn't require his whole body to be preserved. In fact, the company doing the cryogenic storage gets to decide how much has to be preserved. So the first thing that happened as expenses went up and technology advanced is that they decided to just keep the heads, and then to just keep the brains. Here's a passage from the book. Ephrata took in a bunch of money from people like Dodge. They froze a few bodies almost immediately, which probably seemed like progress at the time. But it forced them to keep the freezers running forever after that. They got hit with a lawsuit for some pissed off utopians that depleted their reserves. They never really hit the targets financially. The bottoms fell out after the dot-com crash. In 2003, they did a reorg. Their first step was to cut the heads off and burn the bodies. I'm sorry, could you say that again? Stan asked. They had 11 bodies in cryostorage at that point, Corvallis said, flicking his gaze down at the laptop to verify the stats. The contract that all 11 of those people had signed while they were alive, when they gave Ephrata Cryonics their money, contained an out. It said the remains were to be preserved in cryogenic storage, or through whatever means, in the judgment of Ephrata Cryonics, were best suited to the desired goal of eventually bringing the deceased back to life. And based on that, Corvallis continued, the argument that Ephrata Cryonics now made was that the only thing that mattered was the head, or, when you get right down to it, the brain. The body was basically disposable. Any future society that had enough technology to bring a frozen brain back to full conscious functioning would be able to grow a new body from DNA. So to save money, Ephrata Cryonics decapitated the 11 frozen bodies and packed the heads in a much smaller freezer. But then they decided they don't actually need to keep the brains in a freezer at all. Turns out, he announced, that it's no longer heads in a freezer. ELSH has moved on. Now that we have cloud computing, he said, storing bits is way cheaper than storing body parts in freezers. A few years ago, ELSH, in its sole judgment, decided that the only thing that really mattered was the connectome, the pattern of connections among the neurons in the brain. They took each of those 11 brains and scanned them, reduced them to data structures, stored the data in the cloud. And where are those brains now? Esme asked, because that shoe was going to drop eventually. The scanning, Corvallis said, is a destructive process. He was reading about it as he spoke. Destructive was putting it mildly, but he saw no need to be heavy-handed. By the time it's finished, there's nothing left that could be considered a brain. What is left, they claim, is disposed of in a respectful manner. Cremated, ashes returned to the next of kin. I'm telling you about Dodge in Hell because the question that the characters are grappling with in these passages gives us an excellent way to think about the differences between various theories about the nature of minds. How much of a body do you need to preserve in order to preserve the mind or the person? Dualism says that preserving the whole body and brain is neither necessary nor sufficient. What needs preserving or copying is something else entirely. If you think your mind could ever be uploaded, then dualism must be false. Behaviorism says that whatever you preserve has to be able to have the right behaviors and dispositions. The mind-brain identity theory appears to say that you have to preserve or duplicate the brain, the whole actual biological organ. And functionalism says you don't need to preserve any particular stuff, you just need to preserve or duplicate the functional organization, the abstract pattern of connections. What do you think? I'll tell you now that in Fall, or Dodge in Hell, different people are preserved in slightly different ways, and Stephenson imagines that it has implications for what they can or cannot do when they're revived. But we'll come back to that part of the story in a few weeks. So, how much of your body or brain needs to be preserved in order to duplicate or preserve you? Would you sign up for cryogenic preservation? Would you sign up for having your brain or connectome recorded and uploaded to the data cloud? How do you know that it hasn't already happened to you?